Today's lecture is on slavery and abolition in America between about 1800 and 1860. So for the opening slide of this, I chose to use a picture that represents as kind of a symbol of slavery. This iron collar was used to put on slaves who had a tendency of running away, and for their owners to keep them from running away in the future, they would put this heavy iron collar around their neck, which would be heavy enough to keep somebody couldn't walk very well in it. And they would have bells so you could find them, and that was also very wide, so you'd be hard to get through doors and through thick forests and things like that. And so I chose this slide because it represents kind of an interesting symbol of slavery, and it certainly shows the inhumanity of the institution. So why was there slavery in America? Of course, in previous lectures, we've talked about how there was slavery to grow cash crops like tobacco. But if you remember, we had talked about how slavery, a lot of people thought slavery was on its way out. Slavery was not, it was expensive to own the slaves, to feed them, to clothe them, those kinds of things. And the profits from tobacco were just not that good. In addition to that, cotton, it was very hard to make a profit off of cotton. You need to have a lot of slaves to produce enough cotton, and it was just too expensive. Economically, it wasn't feasible. And then in 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. And the cotton gin makes it so that you need to have fewer slaves to get the seed out of the cotton, and so that makes your costs go down and your profits go up, and so slavery becomes much more profitable. So slavery and cotton are indelibly linked here. The more money you can make from cotton, the more reason you need for slavery. So slavery starts to grow in America. So I have these two maps here. We'll talk about the arrows in just a second. But the first map is from 1820, and the dark color you see there are areas where the slave population is 50% or over of the total population. And you see for the most part it's east of the Appalachian Mountains. It's in Virginia and South Carolina mostly. However, there isn't much of that slavery out west. But then if we fast forward 40 years and we go to 1860, we see that slavery has grown exponentially. There's a lot more slavery east of the Appalachian Mountains, and also it has grown to a great degree along the Black Belt, which is that dark red area of slavery from South Carolina into Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and then into Arkansas and Louisiana. The Black Belt's so named because the soil there is so rich that you can grow tons of cotton. And so we see that as cotton production increases, so does slavery. So if we look at the top map again, I have these two arrows there, and it shows you that the destination for cotton is New England and England. Both of those places have gone into their industrial revolutions. They're making textiles, and so we see that there is an insatiable demand for southern cotton in the textile mills of England and New England, and so that's an incentive, an economic incentive to grow more cotton, hence more slavery. Then the bottom map, we see these two arrows again, but this time it doesn't show us the movement of goods, it shows us the movement of people. As more and more plantations open up in the Deep South, we see a need for more slaves to grow cotton on those plantations. And that's where the Upper South comes in. In places like Virginia and Kentucky, they have a lot more slaves than they need due to natural increase. In addition to that, tobacco growing doesn't require as much slave labor as cotton production does, and so we have an excess of slaves in the Upper South, but we have a need for them in the Lower South. And so we see this internal forced migration of African Americans, quote unquote, being sold downriver to go down from the Upper South into the Lower South to grow more cotton. And so the slave population starts to shift further to the west as America grows west and starts to produce a lot more cotton. So let's talk about cotton. Cotton, as we had said in previous lectures, is a very important crop for the American economy. In fact, by 1840, about 1/4 of all U.S. exports is American cotton, which is a huge chunk of the U.S. economy. And so slaves are an indelible link. They're indelibly linked to the Southern economy. You cannot grow cotton as profitably without slave labor, and so since it's such a big part of the U.S. economy, it's king cotton, that's how big it is, that there's no way we're going to get rid of slavery unless forced to, because it's the economy of the South, and indeed the United States depends on cotton production. Here's another interesting fact. About 1 out of 5 jobs in England at this time are based on, in some way, the southern production of cotton. All of those textile mills in England, they need southern cotton to turn that cotton into, that cotton into clothing. And so England's economy is also dependent on southern cotton. And so that makes Southerners in this Vicksburg newspaper boast that the South can defy the world, for the civilized world depends on the cotton of the South. It creates this large sense of hubris for the South, or this feeling of superiority, because the South is increasingly understanding that the North and England both heavily depend on their crop of cotton to be able to make their economies go. As is always, as we get closer to the Civil War in the next unit, we're going to see that the South has no problem, and they're not going to back down from any confrontation with the North, because they think the North is just too dependent on southern cotton. And even if there is a civil war, probably England will come in on the side of the South because they need southern cotton too. And so we see the importance of cotton, hence the importance of slavery to America at this time. Next, we see Southern society. So imagine, if you will, a giant pyramid. And at the top of that pyramid in the Southern society, and the pyramid represents Southern society, we have these plantation owner elites. So we see this picture of a plantation, and it's on top of this hill. One, it's cooler up there, but symbolically also it shows that if I'm a white Southern plantation owner, I am at the top of society. These people lived lives of privilege. They typically didn't work along with their slaves. They would have, if I'm the owner of a plantation, and it's a large plantation, 100 slaves or more, I hire a white overseer to work the slaves for me and watch over them while they're working. And I might get on my horse and ride around my plantation maybe in the morning or something just to see how things are going. But the rest of my time is spent socializing with the other planter elite, running for Congress, controlling local politics, going to balls, showing off my wealth in some way and my status. These people viewed themselves as kind of American nobility. Now, we don't have dukes and lords and earls and that kind of thing in America, but they almost viewed themselves as that. They're these rich landed gentry who are very powerful and command a lot of social respect. Everybody's supposed to call them yes ma'am or sir, and so we see that they certainly are controlling Southern society at this time. So here's an interesting quote. It's from a plantation owner's wife. Her name is Mary Chestnut. And she's talking about the practice of having slaves on plantations and what it's like to own slaves and control them on your plantation. So she says, God forgive us, but ours is a monstrous system. She's talking about slavery here. Like the patriarchs of old, the people in the Bible of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and concubines. The concubines she's talking about here are the women who are slaves. It was very typical for white plantation owners to have sexual relations with their slaves, sometimes consensual, but a lot of times is not, and they would rape their slaves. And so she says, and the mulattoes, a mixture of African and white, one sees in every family partly resemble the white children. Well, that's because the white children and the slave children both have the same father, the plantation owner. And any lady is ready to tell you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody else's household but their own. Those, she seems to think, drop from the clouds. And so Mary Chestnut here is confronting the idea that a lot of Southern plantation owners' wives, they knew their husbands were they weren't being faithful to them and they were cheating on them with their slaves, but they daren't say anything because it is a patriarchal society. If you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, an excellent movie, and it shows this, that African American women are often raped by their owners, and then the wives of the owners would often blame the slave woman for her husband's infidelity because she couldn't blame her husband. And so we see it's a very difficult situation, obviously, for African American women on these plantations. Now, if we were to go down that social pyramid one step lower, a bigger group than the top is these small slaveholding whites. We can see that in the entire South in 1850, only about 1,700 families owned slaves. About 1,700 people owned 100 or more slaves, I should say. But most of the people in the South who own slaves are going to be owning like 2 to 4 slaves. Probably, 10 or less if we want to group that. And so most of the people who were white in the South who owned slaves only owned 10 or fewer. So they're not these big, large-scale plantation owners. We might consider them kind of a middling class. They have aspirations to get to the upper class, but they don't have the money to buy more slaves and take care of them. And so we see that these people don't have large plantations. They have a fairly good size of land, but some of it is dedicated to cotton production, and a lot of it is also dedicated to staple crops, like having corn and peas and carrots to feed themselves. And so we see that that is the second segment down in society. Next, and a much larger segment of the population, in fact, most of the southern white population, we have non-slaveholding whites. These are people sometimes called hillbillies. They live in the less economically prosperous areas of the South. They may live in the upcountry, up in the mountains. They may live in swampy areas. These are people that own land that is not that great for cotton production because all the good land has been taken up by the plantation owners. And so they own a small farm, or they work for somebody who owns a small farm, and they're subsistence farmers. It's a very hand-to-mouth existence. Everything they have to eat, they grow themselves. And in addition to that, as you can see in this picture, a lot of times they will hire themselves out to the important and powerful plantation owners and work right along the slaves, picking cotton in the field as a way to earn some extra cash. Now, these people were going to form the majority of the Southern Army during the Civil War, and you might ask yourself, well, why would people who own no slaves fight on the side of the Confederacy? It's because of status. You can see from this quote, it says, "Now suppose they, the slaves, were free. You'd see they'd all think themselves as good as we." And besides some grammatical problems here, we see that the poor white population of the South, they don't want slavery to end, because as long as there's slavery, they're above somebody in the social structure. If we free the slaves might be on par with the poor white people, treated about the same, and also they might be competing with them for jobs or land. And so to maintain their social status, we see that the poor white population of the South certainly wants to keep slaves under control. Then we have a very small segment of the population, but even lower than poor white people, we have the free African population of the South. You can imagine this is pretty small because most African Americans are going to be owned as slaves, but there are some slaves who were set free. They were set free either because their owner freed them in their will, like Thomas Jefferson freed some of his slaves, or maybe they were friends with their slaves and grew up with their slave and felt like this was the correct thing to do for their friend. Maybe the slave bought his own freedom. Sometimes slaves who had some skill, whether it was playing the fiddle or being a blacksmith, they were able to hire themselves out on Sundays and keep some of the money that they earned, and eventually able to save up enough to ask their owner if they could buy their own freedom. And if the owner liked the slave or he had an excess of slaves, he might allow them to do that. And so that's how these slaves received some emancipation. They were freed. But once a slave is free, what is their life like? Where do they live? And so we see that these slaves typically would not live in the countryside because they can't get any land that's controlled by the white people, and so they can't be farmers. And they typically wouldn't work on plantations because they're set free. And so they will go to the urban areas of the South. They'll go to Charleston or they'll go to Richmond, some southern city, and they'll typically work there in the ports doing manual labor jobs. Now, their legal status is non-existent. Even if they're free, they're still not considered people or citizens, so they can't vote, can't serve on a jury. And at any time, they could be impressed back into slavery. If I'm an African American who's been freed, everywhere I go, I need to make sure that I have my freedom papers with me, proving my freedom, or I have to have this badge here that says I am free. And if I'm a white person and I'm looking for a runaway slave and I can't find him, I might choose you and say, well, one African American will do as well as another, and I'll take you and I'll rip up your papers and I'll throw off your badge and I'll say you're my runaway slave. And if you try to complain to the local sheriff or public officials, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to take the word of an African American over a white person. And so it's a very precarious existence being a free African American in the South. So why would you stay? Why wouldn't you go north? Why wouldn't you leave for Canada? Well, because they have friends and family that are still enslaved, and they don't want to go so far away that they won't be able to see them. And so this is a very difficult choice for African Americans. Do I stay and risk being returned to slavery, or do I leave and never see my friends and family again? Of course, the largest segment of the population at the bottom of African Americans is enslaved African Americans. So by 1860, that'll be about 4 million African Americans, or anywhere from 1/5 to 1/4 of the entire US population is going to be owned by other Americans. And so this is a very large segment of population. If you remember the earlier slide we looked at, in some areas of the South, it may be as much as 90% of the population is enslaved African Americans and very few white people. It just depends on where you go. And so how were slaves treated? Well, the treatment of slaves really all depended on a couple of factors. One is, did you have any skill? If you were on a plantation and you were a field hand, you were just an uneducated, unskilled laborer, you weren't treated very well. You were worked very hard. We'll talk about more in a second. But you could be beaten, and the owner wouldn't care if he beat you too much as long as you can get back to work at some point soon because you're easily replaced. You're not worth that much to him because he can buy other slaves to put into your position. But some slaves did have some skill, like, for example, you could be a blacksmith on a plantation, or you could be a carpenter on a plantation. And typically you were treated a little bit better because the owner didn't want to damage a slave who had that much necessary skill for the plantation to keep running. So that was one factor. Oh, also, maybe you were a house servant, and so you might be treated a little bit better there because the owner gets to know you personally a little bit more than that. Of course, that could go either way depending on your owner. And that gets us to the second factor that will determine how a slave is treated by other occupation is the demeanor of the owner. Some owners believed that you could get more work out of a slave by beating them and creating fear in them and intimidating them into working harder. Other slave owners believed that you could, if you treated your slaves better with some decency, that they would work harder for you in that way. And so it really all depended on what you had, the skills you had, and then the leniency of the slave owner himself. Another example of treatment is oftentimes slaves would be separated. If your owner, as we talked about, if your owner is in the Upper South and he has an excess amount of slaves, or the plantation isn't doing that well, or you just want to pay for an extra trip or dress for your wife or whatever, you want to earn some cash, you might sell one of your slaves off to a slave trader, and we see this slave trader in the picture. And this happened, families were separated, husbands and wives were separated, children were separated from their parents, as we can see in this picture. And so being a slave in the South meant you never knew when you woke up in the morning if you would be beaten that day, if you would tick off your owner, if he would sell you or one of your family members. And so again, it was a very precarious existence. Now, slaves were typically not beaten until they were killed. You wouldn't do that because if you killed and beat your slave, then you would have to replace that slave and it would cost you money. Slaves were considered an investment, your labor force. But it wasn't uncommon for slaves to be whipped, to encourage them to, quote unquote, know their place, to do what they're told, or to work harder, or to teach them a lesson. And so here we see this picture of a slave that has been beaten repeatedly in his life, and he's developed scars across his back for some of his previous treatment. And then I have this quote here from a slave. It says, "Massa was pretty good. He treated us just about like you would a good mule." And the reason I included this quote, because it really shows you how white owners typically thought of their slaves. They were another, tool on the farm. You wouldn't kill your mule because you'd have to buy a new mule, but you might beat him to get him to work harder. And that's as much value of human life that the slave owners kind of thought that their slaves had. Continuing on with that idea, so we'll go in a clockwise pattern. So in the top right-hand corner, we see this is a church on a plantation, and we see the white owner there with his family in the background. And typically, the plantations were a long ways away from any other place, and they were a long ways away from the local nearest urban center. And so this is where the plantation owners went to church. And he went to church with his slaves. One, he keep an eye on his slaves. And two, he wants to encourage his slaves to be Christian. And a lot of slaves did embrace Christianity. They did it because Christianity offers a promise of hope and salvation. That even though this life is horrible, in the next life it'll be a paradise. And that is a very powerful message to people enslaved. Slaves typically got Sunday off because the owner or the overseer didn't want to work on Sundays. It was God's day. They also have gotten time off during Christmas, as much as 1 or 2 weeks, because that's not the growing season or harvesting season, and so things slowed down a little bit on the plantation during those times. Then we see in the bottom picture, we see slaves working out in the fields. Now, typically, slaves would work in slave gangs. They would work as groups for the simple matter that it's easier to watch them and control them and keep them from running away. And so we would see slaves sometimes chained together, but typically not. They would be watched by the overseer, the person the plantation owner paid to watch over the slaves and encourage them to work. And they would sing choral music. And so one of the slaves would sing out a verse, and then the slaves would respond. And it would have this kind of plodding tempo, because that way you could pace your work and try to work as slow as possible without getting whipped and make it through this long, grueling day. Slave hours tended to be on the season, typically during harvesting and planting season, when a lot of work had to get done quickly in a certain amount of time. The slaves may work from sunup all the way through sundown and well into the night, because there's through the light of a full moon, because that crop has to get planted before it's too late or harvested before it spoils. But when those seasons weren't going on, typically we'd work from sunup to sundown. And then when sundown happens, slaves would then go either tend their own gardens, or they may repair some part of the plantation, or try to cook their own meals and those kinds of things. On the left-hand side, we see pictures of slaves as posing outside of a slave cabin. Now, slaves typically didn't have their own cabins by family. That would be too expensive, and the plantation is a business, so we keep our costs down by having slaves lodge 15 to 20 people in a slave cabin. So you have lack of privacy if you're a slave. You may have this extended family where you share a cabin with your husband, wife, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, those kinds of things. And also you may share the cabin with people who are strangers to you. Because again, you never know when your family is going to be broken up. And so slave marriages often would say, until death or distance do us part. And that's because you know that at any time your husband or wife or whatever can be sold. And so slave communities often would be extended families, or composed of people who you're not related to at all, but people who you've known for a long time, and they kind of are your surrogate father or mother or grandfather or grandmother, because your real ones, your blood relations got sold or away or died. And so we see that that is an example of a slave community. Also, slaves will embrace the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening, if you remember, is a time of a religious revival in America where people are getting, they're reattracted to their faith of Christianity because it offers spirituality, it offers hope and emotion. And of course, slaves are going to embrace the Second Great Awakening as well, because it gives them the emotional strength they need to get through those days, and it promises heaven. And so then we see the top left picture, and I put this picture on here because it shows an African-American woman with a white child. It was considered that, let's say the white plantation owner's wife had a child. It wasn't something that ladies did, was to breastfeed. And so you would find a slave on your plantation that had just had her own child. And so while she's still producing milk, she would be a wet nurse for her own kid and, of course, for the white child, freeing the plantation mistress or the plantation owner's wife up to not have to do this drudgery. And so oftentimes a very close relationship would occur between the African-American wet nurse and their white child that they are nursing and taking care of, and that relationship would then go into the future, and she would be your nanny, and you almost envision her, if you're a white child, as your second mother, perhaps. In addition to that, the child that she was wet nursing is about the same age as the white child, and so they might grow up and be friends, and then as they get older, they would oftentimes be the personal servant of that white child. And so we see that slave owners and their slaves had a very sometimes close relationship. Sometimes it could be very cruel, other times it could be less cruel depending on the will of the owner. But we have this certain, like I said, we have this close working relationship full of hate and fear and sometimes affection, certainly on the part of the white owner, maybe less on the part of the slave, to each other. All right. Now, obviously, slaves resisted this. Nobody wants to be enslaved, and there's all kinds of different ways that slaves could resist being a slave. Most of them, however, are nonviolent. Um, Violent rebellions are very rare because the white population owns most of the guns and they have the power, and none of these rebellions will be successful. There was one in Haiti, the Haitian rebellion was successful, but there is not going to be any successful slave rebellion in America. So how do you resist? Well, one is if you don't want to work that day, you sabotage the tools. You make somehow a wagon wheel breaks or an axle breaks, or you can't find the hose, or you can't find the shovel, or it gets broken. And the slaves would do this and try to do it without getting caught. And so now you can't work that day because the wagon needs repaired. You might work as slow as possible without getting beaten. And so you start to train your owner, the white person who owns the plantation, and you just work as slow as possible. And so they start to lower their expectations of what a slave can get done in a day. And so you're able to kind of pull one over on your owner, and he starts to expect less and less and less to be produced every day. And this is a form of resistance. Of course, before we get to rebellion, running away is a form of resistance too. We'll talk about the Underground Road in a minute. That's a very risky resistance because if you get caught, you certainly will get beaten, sometimes killed, but typically beaten, and so this was dangerous. Now, there are some rebellions that we have in the 19th century. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion in 1822, and that was a plot by slaves in South Carolina, and they decide that what they want to do is they've just heard of the Haitian Rebellion, and so their plot is to join together to go steal a boat in the harbor and then commandeer it and sail it to Haiti. Of course, there's lots of flaws with this plan. Do you know how to sail the boat? Do you have a map to get to Haiti? What's the likelihood that you're going to pull this off without getting caught? And as it turns out, it wasn't a very big likelihood. The slaves were discovered, and Denmark-Vesey and his followers are killed, and it is unsuccessful. Next, we see the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. 1831, so Nat Turner is a slave in Virginia, and his goal is not to escape to Haiti, but to create a slave army. And so he and his fellow conspirators plot to kill the white people on the plantation that they belong to, then to steal their guns and their knives, and then go to the next plantation at night and kill the owners there, freeing those slaves, and the slave army grows and grows and grows. And this does happen. They kill about 50 white people during the rebellion, but eventually the alarm goes out and the Virginia militia is called out and they have more guns, more training, and they will eventually kill about somewhere between 100 to 200 slaves, estimates vary, and Nat Turner himself will be hung when they squash the rebellion. And so these are very dramatic examples of slave resistance, but again, they're not very successful. So next we need to talk about defense of slavery. How did white people in America defend this institution of slavery? As more and more people become abolitionists in the North and try to get rid of slavery, the South feel the need to defend the institution. Well, the first thing they might say is that slavery is ordained by God, that there is the practice of slavery in the Bible, so God must be cool with it, and so how can you argue with God? Next, as we've seen this quote before, the Southerners would say, look, you can't get rid of slavery because the Southern economy depends on it. And by the way, so does the Northern economy. All those textile mills up there you're running, that depends on Southern cotton. And if you get rid of slavery, you're not going to get cotton. And so our jobs will be lost, your jobs will be lost, and it'll destroy the U.S. economy. So leave slavery alone. Next is another religious argument. They say that slaves in Africa were either Muslims or animists. They believed in nature spirits. And so at least when we bring slaves to America, we brought them to Christianity, that we're saving their souls. Yes, this life may be difficult, but the next life is open to them now because we have gifted them with Christianity. Next, here we see the argument that Southerners, so here's a plantation on the right in this picture, and we see that the slaves are happy and this old slave is taken care of. And so Southerners say that, look, we take care of our workers. We feed them and clothe them and house them. And when they're sick, we take care of them. When we're old, we take care of them. And then they contrast that to Northern workers. They say, look, you Northerners, your workers may have freedom in the factories, but, you know, the guy who owns the factory, he barely pays his workers at all enough to have food and to pay for rent. And when his workers get sick, he doesn't take care of them. And when his workers get old, he fires them, or maimed, he fires them. And so they say that, look, even though our workers are slaves, they have a better, happier life than your Northern factory workers. And then the final way that they defend slavery is they say, look, even if all of these things are true and we decide to believe you guys and free our slaves, what then? If we free our slaves, we've been so mean to them in the past, and then we've abused them so much that they will just create a race war and they will kill white Americans. And so even if you don't like slavery, you can't end the practice because it'll just create race war in America. And so all of these are different ways that the South defended the practice of slavery. So that gets us into our next section, abolition. The abolition movement is a reform movement. It's the idea that slavery is wrong and we should get rid of slavery. Now, it's a reform movement like some of the other reform movements we talked about because the goal of abolition is to bring equality to all people, whatever their color, and to end slavery now. And so very much it's an example of an antebellum reform movement, but also it's inspired by the Second Great Awakening, let's go help our fellow man because God says so, or the Jacksonian democracy. All men should have equality and democracy and access to a better life. And so for these reasons, we're going to talk about abolition, but by no means does abolition start in the age of Jackson. In fact, it has its earliest roots in 1775. The Quakers of Pennsylvania, including Ben Franklin, will create the first American Abolition Society. Now, it makes sense the Quakers would do this. They believed that God loves everybody and we're all equal in the eyes of God, and so they were personally and morally against slavery. In addition to that, if we want to provide some context around this first abolition society, the spirit of '76 is going on. The American Revolution is just about to start. And so we're fighting for freedom and equality and liberty from England. And so it looks pretty hypocritical if we ask for those things but don't give our own slaves it. And so if you remember, while the American Revolution is going on and after, the northern states will all free their slaves either immediately or gradually because they don't want to look hypocritical and they're inspired by the Quakers and the spirit of '76. But none of the southern states freed their slaves because their economy depends on it. Their society is built on it. So let's now go forward into 1817. After the War of 1812, what we see is we get this abolition movement called the American Colonization Society. And they want to free the slaves peacefully. And so instead of just waving a magic wand or passing legislation freeing all the slaves, they know the South won't go for that. And so they raise money. It's a big fundraising campaign. And they raise money up north and they go down south and they convince the southern plantation owners, some of them, to sell their slaves to the Colonization Society. And then once the slaves are set free, then the goal of the society is to put them on boats and ship them back to Africa to create a colony of American freed slaves in Africa called Liberia. And so here we see the flag of Liberia today. It has American origins, and that's why it looks like the American flag. In fact, even the capital of Liberia was Monrovia, named after James Monroe, the President of the United States at the time. So this was a noble idea to free slaves, but there were many problems with this. It does not work. First of all, it's very expensive. You can't free all of the slaves because that would take a lot of money. And second of all, the plantation owners wouldn't want to sell all of their slaves. Who was then going to pick the cotton for them? And so it's a very impractical idea. And as to that, nobody asked the slaves themselves before we got this society started if they wanted to go back to Africa. And in many cases, even after the American Colonization Society freed the slaves, a lot of the slaves said, no, thank you. I'm not going to get on that boat. Because what do I know about Africa? My ancestors have been here for 100 years. I don't know anything about Africa. Plus my family's still in America. And so a lot of the slaves that were freed said, no, thank you, and they stayed in America. So for all of these reasons, the American Colonization Society is a failed abolition attempt. Next, the Great Awakening. What does the Great Awakening have to do with abolition? Well, the Great Awakening, if you remember, is this movement to try to get back to God and religion and to be inspired and to help your fellow man as Jesus commanded. And so, of course, some people that hear the message of the Great Awakening are going to believe that that is what they need to do, that Jesus wants us to love our fellow man, and so we should end slavery. And so this will encourage people to join abolition movements in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. So let's talk about some of those abolitionists. Now, we have what you call, quote-unquote, extreme abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison is one of the most famous abolitionists in America at this time, and he is an extreme abolitionist because he wants to end slavery now, today. He doesn't want to wait. He doesn't want it to be a gradual emancipation, free slaves a little bit at a time. He thinks that slavery is a moral wrong and we should end it now. So here's this very famous quote from William Lloyd Garrison, and you can see his tone here. He says, "I'm aware that many object to the severity of my language." So we're going to stop there for just a second. Most of the people in the North were not abolitionists. In fact, there will never be a point in the North's history prior to the Civil War where it's even close to being a majority movement. It's always going to be a very small but growing vocal minority in the North. The reason people don't like abolitionists in the North is they see them as troublemakers. If we insist on trying to get the South to free their slaves, it might cause a civil war. And I don't want to die in a civil war for African Americans, most Northerners would say. It'll destroy our economy. And so all those arguments we talked about before, I don't want to live next to African Americans or set free. And so most Northerners are going to be not abolitionists at all. And in fact, crowds will throw stones and rotten food and even try to mob and beat up William Lloyd Garrison and his fellow abolitionists as they come to town to give speeches. So let's start again. It says, "I am aware that many object to the severity of my language. But is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not to wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell a man to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the rapist or ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen, but urge me not to use moderation in the cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." So you can tell from his tone there, sorry about my poor reading, but you can tell from his tone there that he wants slavery to end now. He does not want it to end tomorrow or the next day or in 10 years from now. He wants it to end now because slavery is morally wrong. And so this makes him an extreme abolitionist. Again, most people aren't abolitionists, and even those that are think that it's impractical to end it just now. What are we going to do with all the freed slaves? How are they going to support themselves? Next, we have Wendell Phillips on the left. Wendell Phillips is a white abolitionist, just like William Lloyd Garrison, and he believes that the best way to end slavery is through boycotts. If we can convince the people up north that they should boycott anything made with slave labor, then maybe we can force the South to economically give up slavery because they're not going to be selling any of their cotton. Of course, this is not going to happen. Most of the people up north are not abolitionists, and they're going to go ahead and buy cotton clothes anyway that were made with slave labor from cotton down south, and it's just going to fail. The next one, of course, we have on the right is Frederick Douglass. This is a picture of a younger Frederick Douglass, and he writes a journal called the North Star. William Lloyd Garrison's journal is called the Liberator. Frederick Douglass is called the North Star because when slaves were trying to run away, they would try to get north into freedom, and they would use the North Star in the sky as a kind of a compass to get there. And so here's Frederick Douglass, a runaway slave himself. He's appearing before a white audience in the North, and he says, "I appear before this immense assembly this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, and this body from my master, and I went off with them." And so this shocks white audiences. They had never really thought about this before, and it really brings home the idea that slaves, who are human beings, are treated like property, and when they run away, they're stealing themselves. And how can you accuse somebody of being a bad person who's stealing themselves? And so we see that he is a great orator and a great ambassador for the abolition movement. And people didn't even believe that he was a runaway slave because he was such a good public speaker. And so he brings the horrors of slavery to Northern audiences because he experienced them in his own life. Next, we see another abolitionist who's an African American, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is known for being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. On the left, you see this picture, and there were certain paths that you could take. So let's say I'm a slave outside of Montgomery, Alabama, and I may know from certain hymns or stories or rumors on my plantation that there is a station on the Underground Railroad. Now, there is not an actual railroad that's underground. It's the idea, it's a metaphor that underground means it's secret, And the railroad is just something that people were familiar with, and so it's a great metaphor. And so the next station or stop on this quote-unquote railroad may be 5 miles away from my plantation, and there might be a safe house there or a station. And so I might run away, risk my life and run away, and all I know is that there's this one stop next to me. And there might be another African American there who's going to hide me in the plantation's barn, or maybe there's a white person who's an abolitionist secretly in the South, and they give me food and shelter, and then they tell me where the next stop is, and then I go to that one and the next stop, and I slowly work my way north, either across the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line, and I get myself to the north and freedom. Now, Harriet Tubman was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, which meant that as an escaped slave herself, she would go back down south and guide people, conduct people from station to station, helping them get to freedom. Obviously, there was a price on her head by Southern slave catchers to try to get her to stop this. But we see that thousands, maybe 50,000 or so African Americans, maybe more, will eventually win their way to freedom by escaping on the Underground Railroad north. Most of them north. Some of them will go into Mexico if you're far south enough. But even when you get north, there's no guarantee of freedom. Now, while there is no slavery in the North anymore by the 1830s and 40s and 50s, it still is legal constitutionally for Southern slave catchers to cross into the North, and if they suspect somebody's a runaway slave, to capture them and to bring them back down south. So many African Americans don't stop even when they get to the North. They'll go all the way to Canada, to a different country where the slave catchers can't go, to try to ensure their freedom. Next, we have Sojourner Truth. She's another black abolitionist who speaks out passionately to white audiences about the horrors and the evils of slavery and try to get them to understand and to get awoken to the idea of what slavery is, because most Northerners don't even think about it, or maybe they've never even seen a slave, and she's trying to recruit people for their movement. So our last abolitionist is a white abolitionist. His name is Elijah P. Lovejoy, and he is in Galena, Illinois, which is on the very southern part of Illinois, and he decided to open up a printing press in his house, and it's an abolitionist printing press. He's going to publish an abolitionist journal, and he wants to send all of this abolitionist material across the river, the Ohio River, into the South, which is just across the river. And of course, Southerners and also Northerners on the border don't want this. They feel that this abolitionist is a troublemaker. He's going to cause a civil war or slave uprisings. And so a mob comes to his house and they tell him to, get out. We're coming in and we're going to destroy your printing press. And he says no, and he fires his gun. And the crowd goes nuts at that point. And so they storm into the house and they kill Elijah P. Lovejoy, making him the first abolitionist martyr in this cause. And then they're going to destroy his printing press and dump it into the river. And we can see here, this is a great example of how Northern audiences did not like abolitionists and would often attack them. And so we can see that the country is starting to split apart on the issue of slavery. So even though most people in America are not abolitionists in the North, it's a growing voice. It's a small but loud voice. And of course, that antagonizes the Southerners. And in the next unit, when we talk about the Civil War, this will be, of course, one of the causes of the Civil War.